Hi YouTube and welcome to my channel. My name is Angie and I'm so happy that you decided to join me here today. The title for this video is not clickbait. I do in fact have worms in my closet. This closet actually. And it's one of my favorite things to tell people that I'm dating because the last partner that I dated had no idea that I had worms in my closet until we were 2 months in, and then I said that and he panicked, understandably. I have been getting requests over on my Instagram to talk about my vermicomposting. So the reason that I have worms in my closet isn't because I am secretly an amphibian and I really like to eat bugs. It isn't because I'm living the Hakuna Matata lifestyle. It is because I don't have a apartment composting program in my city. And compost is expensive. Basically, I was looking into ways to compost in my apartment that wouldn't be smelly, that I could do year round, which in Canada is quite difficult because, well, we're a frozen tundra, like 8 months of the year. So I decided to start looking into vermicomposting. And at first, the idea absolutely disgusted me. I was like, over my dead body, am I having bugs knowingly and willfully in my apartment, in a bin, like ready to crawl into my bed and like, I don't know, cover me in worms or something. Like, ugh. Even just thinking about it now, I'm getting like goosebumps. I looked into it more. One good thing about me being a giant nerd and being obsessed with learning is that when I want to know about something, I do a ton of research. And so I watched like days and days of YouTube videos about vermicomposting. I found a bunch of like websites, I read books, and I eventually found what I thought was going to be the best method for me. How do I say this? Composting with worms is a more controversial subject than I would have expected. Everyone has an idea of how to do it. People disagree on the science of it. The method that I eventually settled on was from this YouTube channel. She has a master's in like biology or ecology or like sustainable living or something like that. Like she's like basically like a scientist. And so she knows her stuff and she's been vermicomposting for like over 15 years. So there was a few criteria I wanted for my worm bin. First was that it could not smell. I did not want my house to smell like compost, please and thank you. But the second was that it had to be cheap to make because at the time I was unemployed and I was living below the poverty line and I just did not have money to invest in this. There are like worm composters that you can get out there for thousands of dollars. And really all you need is a standard bin from Home Depot that you drill holes in. The third thing was it needed to not take up space. That was because I live in an apartment and I live in Canada and I keep the worms outside in the summer unless it gets really hot. And then I'll put like some ice in there with them or something. But generally they stay outside in the summer. But in the winter it freezes and the worms would freeze. So I bring them into my closet. And the fourth thing was that it had to be easy for me to maintain. I know that I will not stick with something if it is not easy to maintain. I know that about me and my mental health and just staying on top of my life. And this one bin system, perfect. It takes me like maybe 10 minutes each week. Okay, so here's the tea. It's literally worm tea. It's called worm tea. I wish I could unhear that, but now you have to hear it too. So people make what they call worm tea from these worm composters. If they have a multi-bin system, sometimes people will collect the liquid that's at the bottom of it. But I trust the scientist that has been doing this for years, and in her video, which I will link below, which is super thorough and explains like everything you need to know about the one bin system, she notes that the worm tea, there shouldn't be excess liquid in your bin if you're doing it correctly. So a lot of people say that worm tea is like really good for your plants, but it's actually anaerobic. So because it's like rotting food and things like that, so it's not actually super helpful for your plants. So that's why I opted to go with the one bin system. It seemed like the science was really sound. It seemed like it was easy and cheap and it hit all of my criteria. So what I did is I went to Home Depot and I got a bin for maybe like 10 bucks. And then I thrifted a drill And so I just drilled a bunch of air holes near the top of the bin. After that, I needed food and I needed worms. Okay, so there's 3 components that you're gonna want for your worm bin to start it off. So the first is you're gonna want your brown material. So a lot of people use like dried leaves or dried grass clippings or things like that for their brown material. This is also compostable paper. I don't have leaves that I can just like harvest. I live in an apartment building. So I take the flyers that I get in my mail and I just shred them, and that's what I use for my brown material. Also like any like compostable things that come with the with my fast food or anything like that, I'll usually just shred it up and put it in the bin. You want to make sure you're not putting like whole flyers in there. Like try and break it down into like shreds, so that way the worms can actually like eat it and it won't just sit there and get soggy and moldy. The smaller your food is broken down, the easier the worms will find to eat it and the faster it'll go away. And then you want to have some grit. So I use some leftover potting soil, but the worms need like rocks and stuff, like grit to help them digest things. And I don't add potting soil anymore. What I use for grit is just crumbled up eggshells about once a month. I'll like freeze all my eggshells in the freezer and then I'll just dry them on low heat in the oven. And then I blend them all up into a powder and I sprinkle it over the worm bin. And that provides them the grit that they need, and it's very similar to grit that they would find in the soil. And then it also provides all those nutrients from the eggs and puts it into my worm castings. After that, you need your food. I'll link her video. Definitely go watch it if you want the ratio. I'm not gonna go over like the starting ratio or anything like that because I don't remember it. The most important thing to your worm bin is making sure that you are feeding them the appropriate amount of food. So when it starts to smell like garbage or when it starts to rot, you know you're feeding them too much food. A proper worm bin, you shouldn't have to add water because the food should have enough moisture that the texture of what is in the bin should feel like soil. It should feel like, you know, sticking your hand into some nice soil and how it's kind of moist but not like really clumpy and wet. What I recommend when you're first starting is to start off slow. So I just found some you can do this. Red wiggler worms. Red wiggler worms. Like Facebook Marketplace, and I think it was like $50, but you can also buy them online. They can ship worms in the mail. They just like ship them in these special packages with soil. So then you add your food. And when in doubt, feed less than you think you need to. You never want to have too much food. If you have too much food, it's going to mess up the balance and it's going to rot and it's going to smell and the worms aren't going to be able to get to it fast enough. And so I put them into the bin and then I took half the amount of the worms. So I think it was like a cup of food, of just like some vegetable scraps from my kitchen, and I put them in there. I left it for a few days and then I went back and checked on it to see how the worms were doing. After doing that, I was slowly able to increase it. I usually feed once a week. So that's just like the most convenient for me when I'm doing my Sunday reset routine and I'm meal prepping on Sunday. I have a lot of vegetable scraps. So that's when I will collect the vegetable scraps and then feed my worms. And keep in mind that the worms will reproduce. So they will only reproduce to the size that the ecosystem in your bin can sustain. So you don't have to worry about having an overflowing bin of worms. They reproduce to fit the size of the bin. And if the bin can't sustain any more worms, then the worms just die or they stop reproducing. So in that first little while, they're going to be reproducing. So they're going to be eating less food than they will once your bin gets up and running. So I decided to go with the once a week schedule. So if there was any food left over at the end of the week, then that's when I realized that I had fed too much food and I needed to feed less. Now I've gotten to the point where my worms can eat 6 cups of food in a week, which is pretty impressive considering it's one bin of worms. They make these beautiful worm castings. So worm castings, you can literally buy these at the greenhouses and they're super expensive. They're $25 for a small bag of worm castings. They're gold, they're solid gold, they're dirt. Gardeners, especially organic gardeners, call this black gold because worm castings, like the worm poop basically, is even better than normal compost because it's just super dense and full of nutrients. Like, it's one of the best things that you can put into your garden, and you'll have a bin full of them. So I've had my worms going for about 8 months, and I am just now getting to the point where my bin is about halfway full of worm castings, and I'm going to harvest some to start some of my seedlings for this spring. You might be wondering, how long can you keep the worm bin going?
2,000 years later.
Well, you can keep the worm bin going for years. The original worms will obviously die off, but then they reproduce and new worms will take its place. So if you were consistently feeding your worm bin, you can have the same bin for like over a decade. A lot of people have had like worm bins for years and years and years. So worm bins are really great that way, is in that once you start one and you get it up to the point where you're able to feed it quite a bit of food, you can like make a significant difference in the amount of food that you're putting into the landfill. So when it comes to feeding them, you can feed them a variety of different things. If I am ever unsure, I Google it, because there's certain things like potato skins. I found out they don't like potato skins. And then what else did I find out they didn't like? Oh, they didn't like bok choy. So they don't like cruciferous vegetables like broccoli or cauliflower or bok choy. They're kind of picky eaters. They also don't like citrus because it's too acidic, or anything spicy. And then aside from that, you just want to make sure that you're not feeding them anything that you wouldn't normally put in a compost bin, like dairy or meat or things like that, or anything super greasy. They love, love, love anything from like the melon family, so cucumbers, cantaloupe, honeydew. Please ignore the state of my stovetop right now. I am in the middle of cooking. But I wanted to show you some of the vegetable scraps I got from my meal prep today. Usually I don't blend things up, but if they're really tough, in this case I have a bunch of woody asparagus ends, I will blend them up just to make it easier for the worms to break down and eat. Some people blend all of their vegetable scraps into like this nasty, gritty worm smoothie, I guess. Smoothie for worms. I don't bother doing that. What I do is I just chop mine up into like 1-inch pieces. Once I have enough, I'll just chop it up into little pieces, and then I take it into my closet, which sounds so creepy. Worms in my closet. This is definitely the weirdest thing about me. I feel like this is a big step in a relationship, is when I finally tell someone about my worms. The way I do this is I will just take my food and dump it into the bin. Yum, that looks disgusting. And you cover it up. So the worms will automatically migrate towards the food. I am going to see if they ate everything that I gave them last week. Usually the worms are hiding underneath the soil. It looks like they ate pretty much everything I gave them last week, so I need to be feeding them more. Yeah, it looks like they ran out of food. But you can see there's quite a few worms, but they're just like chilling underneath the soil. They don't like to come out and play. They like to just hide and eat the food. So I'll probably add more food halfway through the week because they seem to be cruising through it lately. And you just take your trowel and cover up the worms, tuck them back in. If there's a few stragglers, that's fine. They'll migrate over where they need to be. And there you go. That's how I feed my worm bin. I just do that once a week, and this is all worm castings and compost. My feed, I also put in a handful of shredded flyers just to absorb any excess moisture that came from the food. And that's that. So you just want to make sure every week that you're checking to make sure it's that like soil kind of consistency, that it's not too wet, not too dry. It just feels like sticking your hand in some potting soil. So if it's too wet, add more brown matter. If it's too dry, maybe rinse your veg with some water and then put it into the bin. I've had to do that a few times just because my bin has actually gotten too dry. So I've yet to use these in my garden. I started last August, I believe, or July. And I was hoping that I would have enough worm castings to kind of supplement my garden this year on my balcony. And it's looking like that's the case. Harvesting the worm castings There's like this whole process that you can go through that's very complicated. Honestly, I think I'm just gonna scoop some off the top. I'm not gonna go through the work of like taking the worms out of the bin and like putting them on a sieve and like getting all of, no. I'm just gonna scoop the worm castings off the top and just like take a fistful here and there when I want to. And it's been kind of fun to watch. I feel like they're my little friends. I don't know, like I go in and check on them. I don't even see them. Like the nice part is that you don't even have to see them crawling on top of the soil. They're just always underneath the soil where the food is. So if you like get kind of icked out by worms, you never have to see them unless you're like moving the dirt from one side of the bin to the other. I know that a lot of people will put worm castings into their indoor plants. And I even know people that do vermicomposting that sell worm castings on Facebook because people are willing to pay because they're such good fertilizer. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to comment down below. I'm happy to answer them. I'm by no means an expert. I've just been doing this successfully for 8 months, and I did a lot of research beforehand, so I seem to have found something that works really well for me. I'll try my best to answer any questions. I really wanted to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. You could have watched any video on YouTube and you chose to watch this one. I hope I was able to provide you some value and teach you something new and give you something to use in your own worm composting. Or maybe, you know, I was a little bit of a spectacle and it was just kind of fun to watch a weird lady on the internet talk about worms. Either way, I would really appreciate if you would like this video or comment down below or even subscribe to my channel. I post a lot of lifestyle content. I'm a little bit of a hippie, so I do post environmental content every once in a while. But I talk a lot about lifestyle and personal finance and just like the real parts of life. My whole shtick is that I don't want to be filtered. I want to be as real and as authentic as possible. And I would love if you would join me in my little corner of the internet.